My wife cheated on me with our son's teacher. I tracked them down to a hotel, confronted them, and they... So, here's the thing. I never thought I'd be one of those guys posting about a cheating wife on the internet. It always felt like the kind of stuff that happens to someone else. But here I am, needing advice because I think my wife, Amy, is sleeping with our son's teacher. We've been married for 12 years, together for 15. Everything was pretty normal up until a few months ago. Amy's a stay-at-home mom, and I work as an IT consultant. We've got a 10-year-old son, Danny, who's in the 5th grade. His teacher, Mr. Nolan, is this charming, good-looking guy who's new to the school. I remember joking with Amy about how all the moms were probably crushing on him when we met him at Danny's parent-teacher conference. I never thought she'd be one of them. Anyway, it all started with little things. Amy's been acting different. We used to have a routine, you know? Get Danny to school, I head to work, she handles stuff around the house, then we'd all sit down to dinner at the end of the day. But lately, she's been distant, always busy with something else. She suddenly has all these appointments and errands during the day that don't quite add up. Like, she'll say she's running to the grocery store, but when I check the fridge later, nothing's been restocked. It wasn't just that. I noticed she started dressing up more, even on days when she said she wasn't going anywhere. And then there's the texting, constantly on her phone, laughing at something, but whenever I'd ask who it was, she'd say it was just her friends. But she never let me see her phone. She started flipping the screen down when she set it on the counter, and she never used to do that. The kicker? Danny's been talking about how cool Mr. Nolan is, and how his mom really likes talking to him after class. That hit me like a ton of bricks. Why would Amy be talking to his teacher so much outside of school meetings? It felt off, and I knew I had to start paying attention. This could all just be in my head, right? Maybe I'm overthinking it. But it feels wrong, and I need to figure out if I'm being paranoid or if there's something going on between my wife and our son's teacher. The more I thought about it, the harder it became to ignore all the signs. Amy was suddenly interested in every little detail about Danny's school day. Not just the usual, how was school, but asking things like, did Mr. Nolan say anything funny today? Or, what did Mr. Nolan talk about during class? It seemed innocent at first, but the more I watched her face light up when Danny mentioned his teacher, the more it bugged me. Then came the field trip. Danny's class was going to the science museum, and they needed parent chaperones. Normally, Amy avoids those things, says she doesn't have the patience for a bunch of rowdy 10-year-olds, but she signed up this time without hesitation. That raised a red flag. She was even more excited than Danny was, talking about how it would be a fun day for them. When the day of the trip rolled around, I had to leave early for work, so I didn't see them off. But I couldn't get it out of my head. Something wasn't right. At lunch, I decided to call Amy, just to check in and ask how things were going at the museum. When she picked up, she sounded out of breath. She said they were in between exhibits and that she couldn't talk long. I asked her how the trip was going, and she gave me this weird, vague answer, "Oh, it's fine. Mr. Nolan is just so great with the kids, you know? He's really in his element." There it was again, her mentioning Mr. Nolan in a way that felt off. I couldn't shake it. So I asked her directly, "Are you spending a lot of time with him today?" She hesitated, just for a second, before brushing it off. "I'm with the other moms too, of course. It's just easier to help when I'm around the teacher." That was enough to get my mind racing. I couldn't focus on work the rest of the day, and when I got home, I noticed Amy was in a particularly good mood. She was practically glowing, telling me how great the trip went and how Mr. Nolan was just such a natural with the kids. The way she said it made my stomach turn. It wasn't the kind of admiration you'd have for a teacher, it was something else. Something more personal. Something I wasn't supposed to notice. At this point, I knew I had to dig deeper. I couldn't just let this go. But how do you confront your wife about something like this without sounding crazy? I needed proof, something solid to either confirm or dismiss this growing suspicion. So, that night, after Amy went to bed, I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I grabbed her phone. I can't tell you how many times I've heard stories about guys snooping through their wives' phones, and I always thought, I'd never be that guy. But here I was, standing in the dim light of our bedroom, my heart pounding, Amy asleep beside me, with her phone in my hand. The thing was, she used to leave it lying around unlocked, but recently, she set up a passcode. I almost gave up right there, thinking there was no way to get in without asking her directly, but then I remembered something. Amy was terrible with passwords. She always used the same handful for everything, and I had a pretty good idea of what it might be. I took a deep breath and punched in our anniversary date. The screen unlocked. I didn't feel any sense of victory, just dread. My hands were shaking as I started scrolling through her messages, looking for any sign of Mr. Nolan. I passed a lot of the usual, group chats with her friends, messages with her sister, and grocery lists she'd sent herself. Nothing out of the ordinary, until I saw his name. Scott Nolan. I opened the thread, and that's when my stomach dropped. It wasn't explicit at first. In fact, it all seemed professional, talking about school events, class updates, asking about field trips. But as I scrolled up, the tone started to change. Amy had sent him a message a few weeks back, asking if he wanted to grab a coffee sometime to discuss Danny's progress. That didn't seem too suspicious on its own, but his response was what got me. I'd love to. But let's make sure it's a private conversation. Coffee's on me, winking face. There was no mention of coffee after that. In fact, the messages became more casual, more frequent. He'd text her during school hours, even at night when he should have been done for the day. It wasn't full-on flirting, but the way they talked, it was just too familiar. Then, I found it. A picture message. She'd sent him a selfie from the field trip, the one I'd called her during. She was smiling, flushed, with the science museum in the background. Underneath, she'd written, "Such a fun day. Can't wait for the next one." Scott replied with, "You looked great today. Loved seeing you in action," winking face. My chest tightened. That was enough for me to know something was happening. Maybe they hadn't done anything physical yet, but this wasn't normal. It wasn't just some friendly exchange between a parent and a teacher. I could feel it in my gut, there was something more. I had seen enough. I carefully put her phone back on the nightstand and lay down next to her, trying to calm the storm of emotion swirling inside me. Anger, disbelief, sadness, it all hit at once. I felt like my entire world was crumbling, and yet, I still didn't have all the answers. I lay there for hours, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how far this had gone. Were they just flirting? Or had it already crossed the line into something worse? I needed to know more. But first, I had to figure out what I was going to do next. The next morning, I could barely look at Amy. She was her usual self, cheerful, making breakfast for Danny and chatting about her plans for the day, but I felt like I was seeing her through a different lens. Everything she did seemed fake, like it was all part of some act I hadn't noticed before. I didn't say anything about the messages. Not yet. I needed more time to figure out how I wanted to handle it. I knew I couldn't confront her without solid proof, and I wasn't even sure how far this thing with Scott had gone. So, I kept quiet, pretending everything was fine while I was screaming inside. Later that afternoon, I got a text from Amy, which wasn't unusual. She'd send me little updates throughout the day. But this one caught me off guard. "Hey babe, Mr. Nolan invited me to this parent-teacher get-together this weekend. A small group of parents, just to discuss the upcoming school projects. Thought I'd go, make sure Danny's on track. What do you think?" My heart pounded as I stared at the screen. A parent-teacher get-together? Over the weekend? It felt too convenient, especially after what I'd seen in their messages the night before. I didn't buy it for a second. This wasn't about school, this was about him. I texted her back, trying to keep my cool. "Sounds good. You think it'll run late?" She replied almost instantly. "Shouldn't be too late, just a few hours. I'll be back by 9-10 at the latest." Yeah, right. I didn't trust her, and I sure as hell didn't trust him. I had to know what was really going on, so I decided to do something drastic. I called up a buddy of mine, Eric, who's into tech stuff. He's the kind of guy who knows how to get into phones, track locations, that sort of thing. I told him I needed a favor, and he didn't ask too many questions. Eric helped me install a tracking app on Amy's phone, one that would let me see where she was in real time without her knowing. I felt awful doing it, like I was crossing some kind of moral line, but I couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. I had to know what was really going on between my wife and Danny's teacher. Saturday rolled around, and Amy seemed almost giddy as she got ready to go. She took extra time getting dressed, did her hair, and sprayed on the perfume she usually saved for special occasions. It made me sick to my stomach, but I didn't let on. I just kissed her goodbye and watched as she drove off. As soon as she was out of the driveway, I opened the app on my phone. It showed her heading toward the school, just like she said. For a while, I sat there, watching the little dot move, waiting for something to happen. But then, after about an hour, the dot started moving again, and this time, it wasn't going back toward home. It was heading to a part of town I knew well, the area near the park where Mr. Nolan lived. That was it. I grabbed my keys and got into my car, determined to follow her. My heart was racing as I followed the GPS tracker, watching the little dot on my phone head deeper into the residential area where I knew Scott Nolan lived. My mind was spinning, trying to stay calm, but every part of me wanted to drive straight to his house and bang on the door. But I couldn't be reckless about this. I had to keep my cool if I wanted answers. I kept a safe distance, driving slowly, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with every turn she made. After about 15 minutes, the dot on my screen stopped. She was parked. I recognized the area immediately. It was near a local park, not far from Mr. Nolan's house. There weren't many homes around, just a few secluded spots where people liked to walk or have picnics. My gut told me she wasn't meeting a group of parents there. I had to see for myself. I parked a little ways off and walked toward where the tracker showed Amy's car. I moved carefully, staying out of sight, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. When I got close enough, I spotted her car parked near the edge of the park, next to another car, a silver sedan. My stomach twisted when I saw Scott Nolan leaning against his car, waiting. Amy stepped out of hers, dressed casually but looking way too polished for a parent-teacher meeting. The way they greeted each other, it wasn't just friendly. He smiled, and she laughed, leaning in closer than she should have. They didn't even glance around to see if anyone was watching. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen, watching them like a spectator in my own nightmare. I wanted to charge out from behind the trees, confront them both right then and there, but something stopped me. I needed to see how far this would go. Was it just flirting? Or was it something more? Scott said something, and Amy nodded. Then, they both started walking, away from the park, toward the trail that led deeper into the woods. That was enough for me. There was no group of parents, no school meeting. This was a private rendezvous. I couldn't take it anymore. My legs felt like they were on autopilot as I walked back to my car, my head spinning. I wasn't ready to confront them yet. I needed to think this through. What if I showed up and it turned into a screaming match? What if they denied everything and made me look like the paranoid husband? No, I had to be smart about this. I needed a plan. I decided to go home and wait for her to return. Let her think she got away with it. But I wouldn't be sitting idle. No, I was going to gather more evidence. I had a gut feeling this had been going on longer than I knew, and I wasn't going to confront her until I had everything laid out, proof she couldn't wriggle out of. That night, when Amy came home, I was sitting on the couch pretending to watch TV. She walked in, looking a little too relaxed, like she'd just had the best time of her life. She smiled at me, kissed me on the cheek, and asked how my day was. I just nodded, playing along, trying not to let the rage show on my face. It was fine, I said, keeping my voice steady. How was the meeting? Oh, it was good. You know, the usual parent stuff, she said casually, tossing her bag onto the table. Nothing too exciting. I smiled back at her, but inside I was seething. Nothing exciting? I knew she was lying, but I wasn't going to let on. Not yet. I had to play this game until I was ready to make my move. I had already decided to get a private investigator involved. If there was more to this, and I was sure there was, I needed undeniable proof. Amy didn't suspect a thing. She went about the rest of the evening like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't just spent the day sneaking around with Danny's teacher. But every word she said, every move she made, only fueled the fire inside me. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. I just needed a little more time. A few days had passed since I hired Jason, the private investigator. I couldn't just sit around anymore, not with the gnawing suspicion that Amy was involved with Scott, our son's teacher. Jason assured me he'd get the proof, and all I could do was wait. But that wait felt agonizing, like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff, not knowing what I'd find at the bottom. During those days, I kept a closer eye on Amy myself. She was careful, too careful. Her phone was with her constantly, even when she went to the bathroom or just moved around the house. She wasn't like that before. And oddly, she'd become more affectionate with me lately, as if she were overcompensating for something. It was like she was trying to play the perfect wife, but I knew better. It only made me more suspicious. Then, Jason called. "We've got something," he said, his voice serious. He explained that he had followed Amy earlier that day. She and Scott met at a cafe. At first, it looked innocent, just a conversation between two adults. But after their coffee, they left together. And instead of heading back to their cars or parting ways, they drove to a hotel. They were there for about 2 hours, Jason said. I've got photos. When the pictures hit my phone, my stomach dropped. There it was, undeniable proof, Amy and Scott walking into the hotel together, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. It wasn't just the casual familiarity between them, it was the fact that they looked so comfortable. Happy, even. I knew something was wrong, but seeing the photos made it all too real. I sat there, staring at them, my hands shaking. The woman I had spent over a decade with, the mother of my child, had walked into a hotel with another man. She was betraying me, and from the looks of it, didn't seem to have a shred of guilt. I wanted to confront her right away, but I couldn't. Not yet. I needed more than just these photos. I needed to be absolutely sure, because when I did confront her, there would be no turning back. After seeing those photos, it was like something inside me broke. But I couldn't let it show, not yet. I had to be patient, no matter how much I wanted to confront Amy right then and there. I needed more proof, something that she couldn't deny or twist. I wasn't going to give her the chance to lie her way out of this. Over the next few days, I kept playing along, pretending everything was normal, even though every conversation felt fake. I was quiet, but not too quiet. I didn't want her to suspect anything, but the anger inside me was building. Then, one evening, Amy casually mentioned she had another meeting with the school parents coming up on Saturday. That same fake smile, the same casual tone. It was so routine for her now, lying to my face, that it made me sick. Another meeting? You've been busy with those lately, I said, keeping my voice light. She shrugged. You know how it is. Lots of school events coming up. That was the final straw. I had already made up my mind. This Saturday, I wouldn't be sitting at home waiting. I was going to catch her in the act. I called Jason again and told him about the meeting. He agreed to follow her, but this time, I was coming along. I couldn't sit on the sidelines any longer, I needed to see it for myself. Saturday came, and I watched as Amy got ready with the same care she had before. She put on makeup, picked out a nicer outfit than usual, and sprayed on her favorite perfume. She kissed me goodbye, saying she wouldn't be late, and I just nodded, trying to keep my face neutral. The second she pulled out of the driveway, I texted Jason. We met up a few blocks away, out of sight, and followed her as she drove. Just like before, she didn't go to the school. She went straight to the same cafe where she'd met Scott last time. I parked a distance away, my heart pounding as I watched her walk inside. Jason stayed with me, ready to follow them again once they left. We sat there in tense silence, both of us knowing what was coming. About 30 minutes later, they walked out together, laughing, just like before. I could feel my blood boiling, but I stayed quiet. We followed them to the same hotel. This was it. There was no denying it now. Are you ready? Jason asked, watching me closely. I nodded, my hands shaking as I gripped the door handle. This was the moment of truth. I was done playing games. We watched as Amy and Scott parked at the hotel and casually walked inside, like it was no big deal. They didn't even bother looking around to see if anyone might be watching. To them, this was routine, something they had done more than once, maybe even more than I knew. I couldn't sit still anymore. My pulse was racing, and my mind was going a mile a minute. I felt the urge to storm inside, to finally confront her, to demand answers. But Jason held me back for a second, giving me a moment to calm down. You want to do this smart, right? Don't let the anger control you, he said, his voice calm. Just get what you need, and then you can decide what happens next. He was right. I needed to stay cool. I couldn't afford to lose it now. So, we waited a few more minutes, letting them get comfortable. Then I stepped out of the car, ready to end this nightmare. Jason stayed outside while I walked into the hotel lobby. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I made my way to the front desk, and without even thinking, I told the clerk I was meeting some friends. I gave him Scott's name, and surprisingly, the guy didn't even blink. He pointed me toward their room number. I walked down the hall, every step feeling heavier than the last. By the time I reached their door, my hands were trembling, and my head was spinning with every possible scenario. What was I going to find? What would I say? Without hesitating, I knocked. For a few moments, there was only silence. My heart pounded in my ears, and I almost thought about turning back. But then I heard footsteps, and the door creaked open. It wasn't Scott who answered. It was Amy. The look on her face when she saw me was something I'll never forget. She froze, her eyes wide with shock, guilt written all over her. For a split second, we just stood there, staring at each other. I saw the realization dawn on her face, she knew she was caught. What are you doing here? She finally stammered, trying to sound casual, but her voice shook. I didn't say anything at first. I just looked past her, and that's when I saw him, Scott, standing a few feet behind her, looking just as stunned. He didn't even try to hide it. He just stood there, frozen, like a deer caught in headlights. Care to explain what's going on here? I finally asked, my voice surprisingly calm, though inside I felt like I was on fire. Amy stammered, "It's not what it looks like, I swear." "It's exactly what it looks like," I cut her off, the calmness in my voice disappearing as the anger bubbled up. "Don't lie to me. I followed you. I know everything." For a moment, the room was dead silent. Scott looked like he wanted to say something, but he kept his mouth shut. Amy's face was flushed, her eyes darting back and forth between me and the floor, as if she was trying to figure out how to explain this away. "There's no excuse for this," I said, my voice hard. "So, what now, Amy? You going to keep lying? Or are you finally going to admit what you've been doing behind my back?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth was right there between us, and there was nothing left for her to say. The silence that followed my words felt like it stretched on forever. Amy stood there, staring at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. Scott, still standing awkwardly in the background, looked like he wanted to disappear. I could feel the rage inside me building, but I kept it together. I needed to hear her say it, to admit what she'd done. Well? I pressed, my voice cold. Are you going to explain, or should I just leave and let you figure out how to pick up the pieces? Amy finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. That's all she could muster. 2 words. No explanations, no attempt to justify it, just an apology that felt hollow. Sorry? I repeated, my anger flaring. That's it? That's all you have to say? After everything we've built, you're going to throw it all away for this? She looked up at me then, tears welling in her eyes. It was a mistake, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A mistake? This wasn't some one-time thing. She had been lying to me for weeks, meeting Scott behind my back, sneaking around like I was some fool. A mistake is something that happens once, Amy. This is a choice. A choice you made over and over again. Scott, still silent, shifted uncomfortably. I wasn't going to let him off the hook either. I turned to him. And you? No apology? You've been meeting my wife in secret, and this is all you've got? He finally spoke, his voice low. Look, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I cut him off, my patience gone. You didn't mean for it to happen? You made it happen. Both of you did. Amy's tears started to fall then, but I didn't feel any sympathy. Not this time. She had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and now that she was caught, all she could do was cry and apologize. I want you to pack your things, I said quietly, but firmly. I want you out of the house by tonight. Her eyes widened in shock. Please, don't, let's talk about this. There's nothing to talk about, Amy. My voice was steel. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. I turned and walked out, leaving her standing there, sobbing in the doorway. I walked out of the hotel and into the cool evening air, my heart pounding and my thoughts swirling in a storm of emotions. I had just left the woman I'd spent over a decade of my life with in a cheap hotel room, crying after being caught cheating. But despite the anger and betrayal, there was an eerie calm settling over me, like the storm had finally broken, and now all that was left was the wreckage. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. As I got into my car and drove away, a million thoughts ran through my head. How had it gotten to this point? How had I missed the signs for so long? Part of me wanted to scream, to punch the steering wheel, to let all the anger out, but I didn't. I just kept driving, the weight of it all sinking in deeper with every mile. When I got home, the house felt empty. Danny was at a friend's house for the night, and I was grateful for that. The last thing I needed was to explain any of this to him right now. As I sat down on the couch, it all started to hit me. Amy was leaving. My marriage was over. I had thought about this moment so many times over the past few weeks, but now that it was real, it didn't feel the way I expected. There was no sense of victory or relief, just an overwhelming sense of loss. I knew I had done the right thing, though. There was no coming back from this. Even if she begged for forgiveness, even if she promised it was a mistake, I couldn't stay with someone who had shattered my trust so completely. I wouldn't be that guy, the one who just sweeps it under the rug and pretends everything's fine. I couldn't live like that. A couple of hours later, Amy came home. I heard her car pull into the driveway, and I braced myself for the inevitable confrontation. She didn't knock, didn't try to make a scene. She just walked in, her face red and puffy from crying, carrying a small suitcase. I packed some things, she said quietly, her voice hoarse. I'll stay with my sister for a while. I nodded, not looking at her. I couldn't. Not yet. I'm sorry, she whispered again, standing there in the doorway like a stranger in her own home. I know, I said. But sorry doesn't fix this. She stood there for a moment longer, like she was waiting for me to say something more, to give her a sign that we could work this out. But I had nothing left to give. After a long pause, she turned and left without another word. The sound of the door closing behind her felt final, like the end of a chapter one never thought I'd have to write. As the silence filled the house again, I realized this was only the beginning. There were still so many decisions to be made, so many pieces to pick up. I wasn't sure where to start, but one thing was clear, life as I knew it was over. The next morning was the hardest. Waking up in an empty house, the weight of everything hit me all over again. The bed felt too big, the house too quiet. Danny wasn't back yet, and for the first time in years, Amy wasn't there. The silence was deafening. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee, trying to make sense of what came next. I had spent so long trying to figure out what was going on with Amy, and now that I had my answer, I felt lost. I had caught her. I had made her leave. But what now? What happens after your entire world collapses? I thought about Danny. How was I going to explain this to him? He was only 10, old enough to know something was wrong but too young to fully understand. I couldn't lie to him, but the thought of telling him the truth made me sick. How do you tell your son that his mom betrayed you, that the family he thought was solid is falling apart? I didn't have much time to dwell on it because Danny was coming home that afternoon. I needed to get my head straight before then. Amy texted me around noon. Just a single message. I'm sorry again. Please don't tell Danny yet. Let's figure it out together. I didn't respond. What was there to say? I knew we had to tell him eventually, but I wasn't going to let her dictate how that conversation went. She was the one who tore this family apart, not me. But still, I couldn't ignore the fact that Danny deserved to know in the least painful way possible. The last thing I wanted was to hurt him more than he needed to be. A few hours later, Danny came home. He was his usual cheerful self, running in, excited to tell me about his night at his friend's house. It broke my heart just hearing him talk like nothing had changed. "Where's Mom?" he asked, looking around when he didn't see her. I froze for a second, not sure how to answer. "She's staying with Aunt Lisa for a few days," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Danny looked confused. "Why? Is she okay?" "She's fine, Bud," I replied, forcing a smile. "We just need some time to work through a few things." He nodded, not pushing for more, which was a small relief. But I knew this wouldn't last. Sooner or later, the questions would come, and I'd have to tell him the truth. But for now, I just wanted to protect him from the pain that was coming. As the day went on, I tried to keep things normal, made dinner, watched a movie with Danny, tried to keep my mind off everything that was happening. But it was impossible. Every time I looked at him, I thought about what was going to happen when he found out the truth. That night, after Danny went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at nothing, trying to figure out what the next steps were. I knew the divorce talk was coming. I couldn't stay with Amy after what she'd done, but the thought of going through that process, of dividing up our lives, felt exhausting. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the messages I hadn't answered yet. There was one from my sister, who knew something was wrong, and a couple from close friends who were asking how I was doing. I hadn't told anyone the full story yet, not even my family. It felt too fresh, too raw. I wasn't ready to explain it all. Then, I saw the message from Amy again, just sitting there, unread since the morning. I knew I couldn't avoid her forever, but for now, I wasn't ready to deal with her apologies or her attempts to figure things out together. I needed space. I needed time to think about what was best for me and, most importantly, for Danny. One thing was clear, nothing was going back to the way it was. The next few days felt like I was drifting through a fog. I went through the motions, taking care of Danny, going to work, but everything seemed distant. Every time I had a quiet moment, the weight of the situation pressed down on me again. The anger I felt toward Amy was still there, but now, the sadness was creeping in, too. The life we'd built together was unraveling, and there was no stopping it. Amy tried texting me a few more times. Each message was a variation of, "I'm sorry," or, "We need to talk," but I wasn't ready for that conversation. What was there to talk about? She'd made her choice, and it had destroyed our family. There was no coming back from that. One evening, after I'd put Danny to bed, I sat down and started writing a message to Amy. I knew we had to talk eventually, and ignoring her wasn't going to solve anything. I kept it short but clear. "I'm not ready to talk yet, but we need to start discussing the next steps. I'm going to talk to a lawyer this week. I think we both know this marriage is over." I stared at the message for a long time before hitting send. It felt final. Once I sent it, there would be no turning back. A few minutes later, Amy replied. "I understand. Can we talk in person? I want to explain." I had no interest in hearing her explanations or excuses. I didn't care why she did it, only that she had. But at the same time, I knew we needed to meet face to face to figure out the practical stuff, what would happen with Danny, the house, everything. We agreed to meet at a cafe the next day. I wasn't looking forward to it, but I knew it was necessary. When I walked into the cafe, Amy was already there, sitting at a table in the back. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept much since everything had gone down. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the photos, the lies, and that sympathy quickly faded. We sat down, and there was an awkward silence. I didn't even know where to start. Amy was the first to speak. "I know I messed up," she began, her voice shaky. "I know there's no excuse for what I did, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to understand, it wasn't about you. It was, I don't know, a mistake, a stupid mistake that spiraled out of control." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "It wasn't about me?" I repeated, my voice cold. "Amy, you betrayed me. You betrayed our family. How could it not be about me?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel any pity. "I'm not asking you to take me back," she said quietly. "I know that's not possible. I don't know what to do now." I leaned back in my chair, taking a deep breath. "We need to figure out what's best for Danny," I said. "He's the priority now. I'll talk to a lawyer, and we'll figure out the rest. But as far as we're concerned, this is over." Amy nodded, wiping her eyes. "I understand." We spent the next hour talking logistics, who would stay in the house, how we'd handle custody of Danny. It was hard, but it needed to be done. Every word felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. When we finally stood up to leave, there was no hug, no warmth, just the cold reality of what our relationship had become. We walked out of that cafe as strangers. And I knew, despite all the pain and betrayal, this was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I had to rebuild my life without her. After that meeting with Amy, reality started to set in. The end of our marriage wasn't just an abstract idea anymore, it was happening. And the hardest part of it all was yet to come, telling Danny. I dreaded that conversation more than anything. How do you break your child's world apart? How do you tell him that his mom and dad won't be together anymore? I knew I couldn't wait much longer. Danny was smart. He could sense that something was off, even though I'd tried to keep things normal. He had been asking more questions about Amy, wondering why she hadn't come home, why she was staying with Aunt Lisa for so long. The vague answers I'd been giving him weren't going to cut it anymore. That night, after dinner, I sat him down in the living room. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the lump forming in my throat. I had rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times in my head, but now that the moment was here, all of it seemed so inadequate. "Danny," I started, my voice shaky. "There's something we need to talk about." He looked up at me, his innocent eyes full of concern. "Is something wrong, Dad?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Your mom and we've decided that we're not going to live together anymore." His face immediately changed. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice small. "Is Mom coming home soon?" I shook my head slowly. "No, buddy. She's not. Your mom and I love you so much, but we're going to be living in different places from now on." Tears started welling up in his eyes, and my heart shattered. "Why?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Did I do something wrong?" I leaned forward, putting my hand on his shoulder. No, Danny. You didn't do anything wrong. This isn't your fault. It's just, sometimes, grown-ups have problems that are hard to fix, and your mom and we've decided that it's better if we don't live together anymore." The tears started falling then, and he buried his face in his hands. "But I don't want that," he sobbed. "I want us to stay together." I pulled him into a hug, feeling my own tears start to form. "I know, buddy. I know this is really hard. But no matter what happens, we both love you more than anything. That's never going to change." We sat like that for a while, his small body shaking as he cried into my chest. I felt helpless, like I was watching his whole world crumble, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. This was the part one had feared the most, hurting him in a way that I couldn't fix. Eventually, he pulled away and wiped his eyes. "Is Mom going to live with Aunt Lisa forever?" he asked, his voice still shaky. I shook my head. "No, she's going to get her own place. And you'll get to spend time with both of us. We're going to make sure you have everything you need, and we'll both still be there for you. It's just going to be different." He didn't say much after that, just nodded slowly, trying to process everything. I didn't push him for more. I knew he needed time to understand what was happening, just like I did. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of everything settled over me again. Telling Danny was the hardest thing I had ever done, but I knew it was only the beginning. There were still so many questions, so many difficult days ahead. But I had made my decision, and now, I had to focus on picking up the pieces, for Danny, and for myself. The days after telling Danny were quiet and heavy. He didn't ask many more questions, but I could tell he was struggling to make sense of everything. He spent more time in his room, quieter than usual. I tried to keep things as normal as possible, dinners, school drop-offs, but the weight of the change lingered in the air. Amy texted me about seeing Danny, and after a few days, we arranged for her to spend some time with him. I didn't know how that would go, but I had to let it happen. No matter what I felt, she was still his mom, and he needed her, too. When she came by to pick him up, there was a tense awkwardness between us. She didn't try to make small talk, just gave me a sad smile and left with Danny. Watching them drive off felt like another reminder of how different life was now. At home, the house felt emptier without Danny's presence. I sat in the living room, trying to figure out what came next. Divorce papers, splitting assets, deciding on custody, none of it felt real yet, but it was all coming. The life I had known for so long was officially over, and now I had to figure out how to move forward, one difficult step at a time. But for now, I just sat in the silence, letting the reality of it all sink in. The weeks after the divorce felt strange, almost like I was living someone else's life. Danny was adjusting, but I could tell he still didn't fully understand why things had changed so drastically. He'd go quiet sometimes, and I'd catch him looking around like he was still expecting Amy to walk through the door any moment. That was the hardest part, knowing that, no matter how much I reassured him, I couldn't fix what had been broken. We fell into a new routine. I had Danny most of the week, and Amy saw him on weekends. The first time she came to pick him up, it was awkward. We didn't say much, just exchanged a few words about school and schedules. She looked like she wanted to say more, but I wasn't ready to hear it. I was still too angry, too hurt. She left quickly, and I felt relief as soon as the door closed behind her. One evening, Danny asked, "Do you still love Mom?" I wasn't ready for that question, but I knew it was coming sooner or later. I sighed, trying to find the right words. I'll always care about her because she's your mom. But sometimes, things happen between grown-ups that make it hard for them to stay together. It doesn't mean we don't both love you. Danny nodded, though I could tell it didn't completely make sense to him. How could it? He was just a kid. But he didn't press any further, and I was grateful for that. I wasn't sure if I had more answers to give. As time went on, I realized that I wasn't just grieving the end of the marriage, I was grieving the future I thought we'd have. The family dinners, the shared moments watching Danny grow up, those were gone now, and I had to let go of that vision. It wasn't easy, but I was learning how to accept it. Amy and I kept things civil. We had to, for Danny's sake. But the deep conversations we once had, the connection we shared, it was gone. And honestly, I didn't want it back. The trust was too shattered to rebuild. I didn't hate her anymore, but I couldn't forgive her either. I just wanted to move on. One evening, after Danny went to bed, I sat on the couch, scrolling through old photos on my phone, pictures of happier times, vacations, birthdays, moments where we seemed like a perfect family. It was hard not to wonder if those moments had ever been real or if they'd always been hiding cracks I didn't see. But instead of feeling bitter, I felt something else, acceptance. I realized that life wasn't going to go back to the way it was, and that was okay. Things were different now, but that didn't mean they couldn't still be good. Danny was adjusting, and I was learning how to move forward, one day at a time. The next weekend, when Amy dropped Danny off, we exchanged a few more words than usual, about school, his friends, how he'd been adjusting. It wasn't friendly, but it wasn't cold either. It was just normal. And that felt like progress. As I watched Danny run back into the house, smiling, I realized that this was our new normal. It wasn't what I had planned, and it wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to move forward, not just for Danny, but for myself.